Sure. First of all, thank you for joining us. Shubha Poranno, Oxford Bangladesh Society পক্ষ থেকে সবাইকে স্বাগতম. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Oxford Bangladesh Society, welcome to our event. I'm Zaidul Hassan Sajid, a second-year DPhil at Balliol College, and I'm the General Secretary of the Oxford Bangladesh Society. Growing up in Bangladesh, I've always had a certain idea, a certain understanding of the narratives surrounding the 1947 partition. When I moved abroad for studies to Canada and the UK, I began to make friends with some fellow Indians and Pakistanis, and I came to the realization that we have so much in common, yet so little understanding of each other.
I cannot hear anything. Who is
of same historical events. As defining as partition was for our shared history, and remains today within the animosity that is often and unfortunately shared between us all, there are very few events which encourage us as the youth to share our views with each other, to appreciate the similarities and the differences between our shared history and culture. We play cricket with each other a lot, but unfortunately, I'm sure you would understand that often does the exact opposite of building cross-national friendships. When I approached the India Society and Pakistan Society to host a joint discussion, they agreed and worked on this with so much passion and so much sincerity, it was absolutely heartwarming. This is a small representation of the willingness of our young people to understand and empathize with each other, to work together, to foster friendships, and to leave the rivalry on the cricket pitch. I'm grateful to the India and Pakistan Society, and of course, our esteemed panelists and the moderator for making this event happen. And it is our absolute privilege to be hosting this together. We hope you enjoy this event and the lineup that we have prepared for you today. And without further ado, can I please now request Kanika to say a few words?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kanika, and I'm currently the president of the Oxford India Society. And when Zahid approached me about doing this event, I was a bit hesitant because I wasn't really sure about how it would work out and whether it would be all cordial. But I'm really excited for this event, and I think it's super important for all of us to interact with each other, especially because we have so much culture that we share together and so much history that we also share. And I think moving forward, I hope that we do a lot more future events together. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Akhtar Mahmood to introduce the panelists and to start the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for organizing this event. And indeed, this is a very important subject. And although 73 plus years have passed by, the subject of partition remains a topic of introspection, debate, and maybe sometimes controversy as well. So I think it's a very good initiative to go back into history, try to understand the context in which first India was partitioned, and then after 23 years or 24 years, Pakistan itself was partitioned and Bangladesh was formed. Today we have a very distinguished panel with us. We are hoping that Professor Nurul Islam, who even at the age of 92, does use Zoom technology quite efficiently, although we are having some hiccups today. But we are delighted to have him here with us today. Professor Islam was a professor of economics at Dhaka University in the 1950s and early 1960s. And after that, he went on to head the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, which he basically grew up. He built up the institute till the breakup of Pakistan in 1971, after which he became the first deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of Bangladesh. And a few years before that, he had come very close to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, advising him on various topics, in particular the implications of the 6 points, which was the demand for autonomy that Sheikh Mujib had articulated in the mid-60s. So Sheikh Mujibur Rahman invited him to head the first planning commission, which Professor Islam did till early 1975, at which point he took leave, and in fact, he became affiliated with Oxford University. He was a fellow at St. Anthony's and subsequently became the Assistant Secretary General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, and came back to a more research world, which was always his profession. And he has been with the Institute, the International Food Policy Research Institute here in Washington, DC, where he's now an emeritus fellow. So Professor Islam has seen firsthand the debates and discussions in Pakistan around the issue of economic disparity. But he has also recently written a booklet, I would say, it's called A Primer on the Political History of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, where he has some interesting views on why the partition of India happened in 1947. We have with us Professor Faisal Devji, who is a professor of Indian history and is associated with St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Professor Devji has written a number of books, one of which is The Impossible India. It's on Gandhi. But the one which is particularly relevant for today's discussion is called Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea. And I'm sure those of you who have not heard about the book will be intrigued by the title Muslim Zion and would realize that there must be some parallels being drawn with Israel, and indeed that's the case. And we will talk to him about this book and its relevance to the question of partition. Then we have Professor Harun-or-Rashid, who is now Vice Chancellor of the Bangladesh National University in Dhaka. Before that, he was a Professor of Political Science at the Dhaka University. Professor Harun-or-Rashid, in a sense, is also a historian because his PhD thesis is arguably the most definitive history of the Bengal Muslim League during the period 1906 to 1947. Bengal Muslim League and Bengal politics of that time. And we will hopefully get some very interesting insights on what was going on in Bengal, and particularly amongst the Bengali Muslims in the run-up to the partition of 1947. And then we have Professor Yaqoob Bangash from the Information Technology University in Lahore. Professor Bangash has also an affiliation with Oxford. He did his DPhil in modern history from the University of Oxford. And he is currently, as I understand, doing a very interesting piece of research, which is on the imagining of Pakistan as reflected in the debates and discussions of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan during the period 1947 to 1956. So we have a very, very rich panel today, and I'm very honored to be able to moderate the discussion. I am Akhtar Mahmood. I was a student at Oxford many years ago in the 80s when I did a DPhil in economics. But as I often say, I've forgotten much of my economics during my long career at the World Bank, where I worked on private sector development issues. So I think without much ado, we will start the discussion today. The format is that I will ask each of the panelists a set of questions, and we'd expect a response for about 7 or 8 minutes in the first round. And then we'll have a second round where we'll go back to the panelists for about 4 or 5 minutes each. And then we open up the floor for questions and answers, questions from the audience and answers from the panel. So I'm hoping that Professor Nurul Islam was able to listen to what we have been saying so far, because my first question actually would be to him. Professor Nurul Islam, are you with us?
I can hear barely, very low voice.
Okay, but we can hear you very clear. So
Okay.
let me pose the question to you first. We'll start off the panel discussion with you. So in this book, which I actually have here, and let me show it to the audience. It's a short book. It's called India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, a primer on political history. And in this book, you're sort of challenging Jinnah's contention that Muslims constitute a separate nation. And secondly, because they are a separate nation, they should have a separate state of their own. You are sort of challenging both these contentions. But at the same time, you're saying that there is nonetheless a justification, or there was a justification for the partition of India, but that justification lies elsewhere. And interestingly, you're saying that the same justification applies to the partition of Pakistan in 1971. So it's a very interesting set of arguments that you have there. So we'd like you to please expand on these topics, these arguments that you have made in this book, Professor Islam.
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead, Professor Islam.
Hello.
Yes, hello, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Now, the first question is, the nation a nation doesn't necessarily require a state, because a state in many cases consists of many nations, and in some cases a nation defined by religion split among various states. So they are not identical. The nation doesn't mean need to require a state, neither a state require a nation. Hello?
Yes, hello. So therefore you are saying that Mr. Jinnah's contention that because the Muslims are a separate nation from the Hindus and others in the Indian subcontinent.
You see, his contention that Muslims constitute a nation is based on one criteria, religion only. But a nation is not defined just by one characteristic. A nation is defined as a group of people who share the same experiences and have the same objectives for the future. So that definition he doesn't apply. He just religion. Muslims constitute a separate nation, period. I contest that because there's no such definition of nation being just a group of people as one religion, therefore there must be a nation. Secondly,
so you are suggesting that the movement of the Muslim League or the contention of Mr. Jinnah that Muslims should have a separate state of their own, that is not justified on the reasoning that they are a separate nation.
That's right.
In your book, yes, please, go ahead.
The question is, what is a nation? I'm saying a nation cannot be defined by one characteristic such as religion. A nation is contributed to by a host of factors. One of them may be religion. Common experiences, common tradition, history, past, future experiences, future objectives, aspirations. Therefore, his definition of a nation is incomplete. And then second question is, does a nation require a state? This is neither factually correct nor analytically correct, because a lot of states in the world have more than one nations inside, and one nation is defined by religion or even ethnicity or even language. North Africa is split among various nations, same people.
Right. So you're saying that being a separate nation is neither a sufficient condition nor a necessary condition. So the sufficient condition.
That's correct. Even firstly, his definition is wrong. Secondly, whatever definition, whatever characteristic, multiple characteristics contribute nation, even then, a state necessarily does not mean a nation state, because state can have multiple nations. Similarly, one nation defined by these characteristics can be split among various states.
So you're saying that separate nationhood, even if you could define the Muslims as a separate nation, and you're contesting that, even if you could do that, that was not sufficient to justify the demand of a separate state.
Correct.
However, you're also saying that's not necessary. It's not necessary. So even though you're suggesting that the idea of Muslims being a separate nation, you're contesting that. Nonetheless, you're saying that there was a justification, a different justification for the partition of India. So can we come to that? Can you please explain that?
The justification for partition of India was that the parties in an electoral democracy, today's majority is tomorrow's minority and the reverse. Because it depends on ideas, ideology, various policies, etc. In the case of India, the political parties were based on one unalterable characteristics. In other words, If you are a Muslim, you belong to a party. If you are a Hindu, belong to another party. The question of changing parties, not by definition, is fixed. The Muslims are constitute a party, Hindus constitute a party. Now, in any electoral democracy, if you have this kind of situation, the parties are defined by unalterable characteristics such as religion, then in any election, the majority will be permanent majority. In other words, India, the Hindus will be in permanent majority, Muslims will be in permanent minority, and the democracy is unworkable in this situation.
And Professor Islam, you extend that logic, or you use that logic again, in the context of Pakistan after it was formed in 1947.
Same thing in the case of Pakistan, when your political parties were based on space. Let's say Awami League was in East Pakistan and Muslim League was in West Pakistan. Therefore, and the majority was Awami League. Therefore, there will be permanent majority of Awami League in any national government. There will be permanent minority of West Pakistanis. So therefore, they'll be under control of the permanent majority of East Pakistan. As in India, it was the other case. So in both cases,
yes,
it's not possible to have parties based on this kind of characteristics at the same time have democracy.
But we know that when the Awami League was first established, it was a national party. It didn't start off. I'm saying that when the Awami League was established in 1948, it was established as an all-Pakistan party. It was not an East Pakistan-based party. Correct. It was not a region-based party.
It became a region-based Pakistan.
Over time, it evolved to becoming a de facto region-based party.
Correct.
Why
correct.
that? Why did we come to that?
Because as a party comprising of both parts, this party did not promote the interest of both parts. They concentrated on the part that was dominated politically by the West Pakistan. So therefore, the East Pakistan's economic and political aspirations were not met by this party. So there was an election in United Front, all the opposition parties in East Pakistan combining, and they, in 1954 election, they won, they eliminated Muslim League as a party in East Pakistan. That was the result of being then one party here, one party there. Previously, it was not there because that one party was unable to or unwilling to take care of the interest, economic and political aspirations of both parties, both parts of Pakistan, I mean.
Okay, so that's a very interesting set of arguments you make on the concept of Muslims being a separate nation, and then a justification nonetheless of India's partition. And you're saying that the same logic applies to Pakistan's partition because of the way the politics
because the permanent majority destroys the concept of one country under democracy.
Right. Now, this need not have been the case in Pakistan, but the way politics evolved in the initial years, and this is a subject which Professor Bangash can also talk to us about later. But thank you very much, Professor Islam. We'll come back to you in the second round after listening to the other panelists, but that's an intriguing set of arguments that you have made here, which I'm sure will lead to some discussion and perhaps some questions from the audience. If I can move to Professor Devji now. Professor Devji, in your book, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, you're suggesting that Pakistan has never been a nation state in the conventional sense. And in one of your chapters, which is called The People Without History, at the beginning of the chapter, when you talk about the emergence of India and Pakistan as separate countries, you say, and I'm quoting from here, Pakistan did so, that is, emerge, with the claim of having made a radical and unprecedented beginning, of having inherited nothing from the past, not even from the past of Islam, by which it justifies its existence. So in a sense, Pakistan is starting from scratch And if I understood your arguments correctly, that's what Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted the Pakistani nation to do, to think of themselves as a nation, but from scratch, which is contrasted in your book with Nehru's famous speech, The Tryst with Destiny, where he's talking about recovering, reclaiming history after many years of colonial rule. So this idea of Muslims forgetting their history, starting their journey as a nation completely from scratch, and the fact that this is necessary for them to have a peaceful coexistence with Hindus, whether it's in the same country or as neighbors, was the core of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's message or his approach, if I've understood you correctly. So I'm just throwing out these quotes from your own book, but I'm not suggesting that you necessarily start your discussion with this, but I'm just mentioning this because I found this very, very interesting indeed. Professor Devji.
Yes, thank you very much. You know, one of the things I was interested in when writing that book was to show how conventional ideas of nationality, which tend to be based upon notions of historical inheritance, of linguistic, cultural, and other commonalities, seem to have been set by the wayside in the making of Pakistan. And this happened, I argue, for very good reasons, precisely because Hindus and Muslims and people who eventually became Indians and Pakistanis were in fact so intertwined historically, culturally, linguistically, and indeed ethnically, genealogically with one another, that it was almost impossible to divide them into separate nations, each with its own history. Even the idea of Islam was not capable of doing it, in part because there remained a very large Muslim population in what came to be India, and an even larger, proportionally speaking, Hindu population in what came to be Pakistan, particularly in East Pakistan. So the only way in which Pakistan could be presented to the world as a new nation was, in fact, by rejecting these conventional foundations, mythical as they may be, of nationality. So my book, played with this idea of what does it mean to found a nation that is so radically separated from any received idea of what nationality is. And in doing so, I tried to, if you will, separate out analytically Indian and Pakistani forms of national belonging. But, getting to the issue of partition in particular, what I'd like to say, connecting your remarks and your quotations from Muslim Zion to the subject of our discussion today, is that you can see this refusal, if you will, of history in Jinnah's understanding of partition. So we normally tend to think of partition as being the result of an intractable conflict. Certainly there was a conflict between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, and perhaps even between large sections of Hindus and Muslims. But in Jinnah's view, this conflict did not result from the foreignness or the externality of the enemy, right? So it's not because the Muslim League and the Congress, or Hindus and Muslims, were foreign to one another that they entered into a conflict. On the contrary, in Jinnah's view, they were too intimately intertwined with one another, historically and politically and in every other way. The violence of communalism, therefore, in his view, came out of the very intimacy of Hindu and Muslim relations, the relations indeed between the Muslim League, which was staffed in Jinnah's day by, as it were, refugees from the Congress, very largely. Right? So the people who led the Muslim League had often been, like Jinnah himself, members of the Congress, long-standing members of the Congress. So this too is a sign of their intertwinedness and their intimacy. What partition was meant to do was to separate out these rival parties and these rival communities. And in that way, Jinnah thought, to make a kind of peaceful coexistence possible. if only by way of partition. When you look at the vernacular language of partition, you see this very clearly. In Urdu, the word taqsim or taqsimat in the plural, partition. In Hindi, the word batwara, both mean a kind of apportionment. Both are words of domestic import. They are used to describe the partitions of family properties, for instance. Right? They are not purely political terms. And this is what is crucial about them. Jinnah tended to describe the partition of India as if it were the partition of an ancestral property, the kind of partition that he so often presided over as a lawyer in the Bombay High Court. And what he would say is that we have two brothers here. So the problem is the fact that they are too close to each other. They are brothers, Hindus and Muslims. And only brothers can hate each other in such a way, can feel that they've been betrayed by one another. The feeling of betrayal only comes from your intimate. It cannot come from a stranger. And therefore, his view was that just as you can partition a parental property once the parent has died, the parent in this case being the British Raj, to create friends out of brothers, so too India and Pakistan will be created so as to turn brothers into friends. Now, it's a very interesting set of ideas, but it's also one that, of course, is entirely abstract. And this is why someone like Gandhi criticized Jinnah for being an idealist. Gandhi called Jinnah an idealist when speaking to the governor of Bengal. Jinnah, of course, thought that he himself was a realist. Gandhi understood that this way of thinking, interesting though it was, might not survive the dose of reality that partition would inevitably bring in its train. So just to wind up by saying that any attention to the vernacular language of partition tells you immediately that the British and international understanding of it was only, if you will, skin deep. So the partition, of course, is a British imperial form. It was deployed first in Ireland, then in India, then in Palestine, and has become a kind of form that is popular in the international community, represented by the United Nations. More recently, of course, it has been deployed in Kosovo and in Bosnia, etc., in these places. In Sudan, in Timor, all of these places have had partitions. But its origins are as a British imperial policy, which seeks to, as it were, defer or displace enmities by abstracting the British state from them through a kind of partition. And this mode of dealing with decolonization can be contrasted very nicely with the French way of doing so, which tended to be through civil war. Whether you look at Algeria or you look at Vietnam, where the French were unable to, as it were, disengage by leaving the problem to their successors. They were involved in these civil war type situations, and they could not extricate themselves as easily as the British seem to have done in all of these situations I've described. So that is, as far as the British and the internationalist view of partition is concerned. The Indian views, as I've tried to suggest in describing Jinnah's understanding of it, can be rather different, indeed can be utterly opposed to the international understanding of partition, which presumes a kind of enmity based upon ignorance or externality or foreignness. Here we are talking about something quite different. How do you deal with intimacy?
Thank you, Professor Devji. If I may just pursue for a couple of minutes this subject, as I understood it, this theme of sort of forgetting history and starting afresh. And did I understand it correctly that for Mr. Jinnah, the argument was that because the histories are so intertwined, which means that there are narratives of a harmonious relationship as well as narratives of conflict and oppression by one party over the other, etc. You have a mix of both. And it's possible that an invocation of the harmonious narrative might get the Muslims into this false sense of feeling that there is no difference between them and Hindus, whereas he believed that Muslims are a separate nation. So that's the problem with the harmonious part. And the problem with the more hostile part is that it will make it very, very difficult for two brothers to live together as brothers, right? So the lawyer, as he was, Mr. Jinnah, probably had a great faith in the ability of legal solutions. So two parties as legal persons coming together and signing a contract. For that, they have to be two legal persons, and therefore the idea of two separate nations. But nonetheless, Pakistanis should start thinking of themselves as a nation afresh from scratch. Is that a correct way of reading your book?
Yes, I mean, that is, I think, indeed Jinnah's position. You know, for him, the idea of nationality, of Pakistani nationality, was, in my view, entirely negative. The nation, remember, before the famous two-nation theory, the categories in play were majority and minority, right? A Hindu majority and a Muslim minority. Let's leave aside for the moment that neither of these groups were uniform or homogeneous groups, and they still are not, right? What Jinnah does is to get rid of the language of majority and minority because he sees it as disadvantaging the minority, which always has to exceed somehow to the majority. So he brings up the idea of a nation in order to create parity between the two groups, despite their disparities of size, right? So how do you create a relationship of parity legally speaking, of equality legally speaking, or constitutionally speaking, by refusing Muslims the status of a minority, which is a status they had, as it were, voluntarily accepted for decades in the past, and to call them instead a nation. So this allowed for the Muslim League to negotiate as an equal party with the Congress. And what Jinnah meant to do by creating this legal fiction of equality is to have the two parties then enter into what he called a social contract. Now, as we know, the social contract is a kind of European idea emerging in the 16th or 17th centuries, associated with names like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau. And what Jinnah thought he was doing was, for the first time in history, making real, giving reality to what had until now been a purely ideal or abstract theory, European theory. He thought that Hindus and Muslims, represented by the Congress and the League, could and should enter into a social contract that, as it will, allow them to disengage from one another in a way so as to turn brothers, as I was saying earlier, into friends, right? Through a contract, because brothers, of course, are not linked by a contract, or should not be. They are linked by relations of emotion, sentiment, love, or indeed of hatred. The love and hatred are two forms which can characterize brotherly relations. So you need a contract to, as it were, pull them apart. And this was the famous social contract, which he kept talking about. And when partition happened, he thought it was an extraordinary achievement on the part of both Congress and the League, because he understood them as having entered for the first time in human history. Two states were created on the basis of a set of debates and discussions leading to a contract by civilian figures without the use of military force. So Jinnah thought this was a sterling, a wonderful, unprecedented, or as he put it, titanic achievement. Of course, his hopes were destroyed very soon afterwards because the violence of partition overwhelmed this apparent achievement. And that was something he had neither really predicted nor knew how to address. It's actually quite interesting that he was so wedded to his theory. I mean, he thought he was making the theory of the social contract historically true for the first time. but he didn't understand that in some ways he was simply accentuating its theoretical nature and imposing that theory onto a history which buckled under it, which would not accept it.
Of course, Mr. Jinnah, had he lived longer, may have seen other disappointments in the context of Pakistan, and we will gradually come to those issues. And this may be a good segue to bring in Professor Harun-or-Rashid, who is joining us from Dhaka in Bangladesh. Professor Rashid, in your book on the Bengal Muslim League and the Muslim politics of Bengal in the first half of the 20th century, there are a number of themes which come out. And one is that there was always some tension, sometimes quite serious, sometimes maybe a bit contained, between the All India Muslim League and the Bengal Muslim League. So there was some dynamics going on there. Secondly, the Bengali Muslim leaders, both on the political side, but also on the intellectual side, had started imagining a kind of homeland, initially in the context of United Bengal, including even the province of Assam. But later on, when it was clear that that United Bengal idea is not going to materialize, and it will be an East Bengal as part of Pakistan, I'd like to just remind the audience that the name East Pakistan came into being only in 1956 when the Constitution of Pakistan was passed. That province was called East Bengal for about 9 years. So the Bengali Muslims, and there were others who were not necessarily Muslims, but nonetheless may have subscribed to the same idea. They had started imagining a kind of homeland, whether as a separate Bengal, a country of Bengal coming out of India, or later just East Bengal as part of Pakistan, in terms of what kind of polity, what kind of economy, what kind of society it would be. So that imagining had been going on in the period which you cover in your book. Of course, there were some differences of opinion as well. So perhaps you can give us a flavor of these themes that you address, the sort of tension between the all India Muslim politics and the Bengal Muslim politics, and the kind of imagining that was going on in the minds of the Bengali Muslim leaders, whether on the intellectual side or the political side.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mahmood. Good afternoon and excuse me, good evening to everybody. Well, I was listening to the statements and the discussion already made by the distinguished panelists. But I would like to mention that the Awami League, which was founded in the year 1949, at the time it was not an all Pakistan political party. Its name was East Pakistan Awami Muslim League. All Pakistan party, I mean, there was a committee, just a committee, and Hussain Shaikh Sarwardi was the convener of that committee, All Pakistan Awami League. And the word Muslim was dropped in the year 1955. I mean, immediately after the United Front elections and 48 and 52 language movement. So initially, Awami League was an East Bengal political party, and it remains so throughout. Awami League never ever emerged as an all Pakistan political party. Even the election results of 1972 bears a testimony to it that it was a party of the Bengalis, and it never endeavored to be an all Pakistan political party. It represented the interest of the Bengalis. Thus, this is one point I would like to clarify. The second point is the sixth point. You mentioned that sixth point was a demand for autonomy. I beg to differ. And Professor Islam in his book India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, he has also dealt with is that the 6-point demand was a charter of independence of the Bengalis, right? Though the word independence is not incorporated in 6-point program. Again, may we remind that the word Pakistan is not in the 1940 Lahore resolution, but the state that was established in the year 1947, it was the state of Pakistan, right? But the word was not there. Similarly, independence, the word independence is not in history 1966 Lahore 6-point program, but its goal was the national emancipation of the Bengalis. That is the independence of the Bengali nation, in our word, to establish a separate state for the Bengalis, right? That was the intent and the purpose of the 6-point movement, right? Next, but if we want to understand the emergence of Bangladesh and disintegration or dismemberment of Pakistan, then we have to go back to history beyond 1947, that what was the Bengali view of Pakistan? And this is very crucially important. And Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who is the father of the nation, Bengali nation, and the creator of Bangladesh, he was actively involved in Muslim League and Pakistan movement, as we all know, right? But after 1947, from the very beginning, I mean, he launched his movement to create a nation state for the Bengalis. Why it was so? Then what was his state vision? And as you mentioned, that preceding 1947 partition, there was a move initiated by the last Chief Minister of United Bengal, namely Hossein Sohrawardi, that was a move for United Independent Bengal. And Sharad Bose, Kiran Shankar Roy, Abul Hashim, and some other leaders were associated with that move. And Bangabandhu, at that time, he was a student leader, youth leader in Calcutta, and he was also actively involved in that move. He was against partition of Bengal, and he was for United and Independent Bengal. That point should be kept in mind if you want to understand the subsequent political development in the aftermath of 1947, that is creation of Pakistan, that why Pakistan did not survive. This is one thing. Next, I would like to pick up some other points that, well, for India's partition, I think first it was the British colonial rulers who made it. Had there been no colonial intervention through the battle of policy, the political landscape of India could have been different, first. Second, for 1947 partition, in my book and also in Professor Islam's book, and I am in full agreement with him, that the Congress High Command, particularly Nehru and Patel, they made a history blunder. Should we say that, as a matter of fact, they were the creator of Pakistan, or they were rather, in a sense, responsible for 1947 partition? As Professor Devji mentioned, then India had been in Congress for quite a long time. And Muslim League was founded in the year 1906 in Dhaka. At that time, Zinia was opposed to Muslim League, and he founded another organization in opposition to Muslim League. He was not a founding member, you know. He had been at that time in Congress. And it was in the year 1940, then 1906 and 1940, just to see, a long period. And Zinia was also known as the best ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. That is in history, right? Then why should Zinia come up with the idea of Pakistan? This is one question to be asked. Next, the point I would like to mention and emphasize that had there been no, that extent of support, all-out support toward for Pakistan from the side of the Bengali Muslims, there would have been no Pakistan and no partition, because Pakistan and Muslim League movement was very, very weak in present Pakistan states or region. It was very, very weak. And if you have read or gone through my work, The Foreshadowing of Bangladesh, you pick up the subtitle of my work, but I would rather prefer to start with the title of my of the work of my book, that is The Foreshadowing of Bangladesh. That is the genesis of Bangladesh. That was even the work stopped up to 1947, but the title of the book is The Foreshadowing of Bangladesh. I could foreshadow the emergence of Bangladesh even before 1947. How could I do that? First, one thing, the British colonial rulers, we know their policy of divide and rule, etc., etc. Even Mr. Gandhi said that we used to live like brothers, right? And it was not Mr. Jinnah, rather Mr. Gandhi said to Jinnah that, look, we are brothers. We used to live here for centuries after centuries. The Muslims used to rule India for about 550 years, both in Delhi and in Bengal, right? For quite a long time. So we have a common history and sometimes common culture and heritage, etc., etc. But the introduction of the permanent settlement in the year 1793 by Lord Cornwallis in Bengal, was detrimental to the growth of common Bengali nationalism based on language, and the divide in Bengal, in case of Bengal, along the religious line, it was essentially because of the 1793 partition of introduction of permanent settlement. And what was the basis of Pakistan movement and Muslim movement in Bengal? What to look into the matter very carefully and critically. It was not religion, It was not religion. If it were religion, then Pakistan would have survived, and there would have been no Bangladesh. It was essentially socio-economic and political emancipation. That was the concern of the Bengali Muslims, and they wanted to get rid of landlordism and the Mahazani system, and they want to get it, and they wanted emancipation from their exploitation, So in Bengal, it was out and out a political movement. And as I see it, 1947 partition, religion was used by both parties or all the actors, but it was not the main issue or agenda. It was out and out a political issue, a political, matter. Then why should partition take place? We know that there was a cabinet mission in 1946, and Jinnah accepted that cabinet mission plan. And a Pakistani scholar, namely Aisha Jalal, her thesis, Jinnah, the sole spokesman, in her thesis, he holds the view that, that if Congress and Congress High Command would have accepted the cabinet mission plan, then there would have been no partition. Rather, there would have some kind of loose, federal India, or either federal or confederation. Under cabinet mission plan, A, B, C, 3 regions. B, present Pakistan, C, present Bangladesh, and Bengal and Assam, this region, and the remaining part of India, A, B, C formula, right? And there will be a central government, but very weak, only foreign affairs, defense, and currency. And remaining residual powers will be in the hand of the 3 regional government. So Jinnah accepted that cabinet mission plan, both its long-term and short-term goal. But Congress, particularly Nehru, he did not accept it. He said, it is the Constituent Assembly who will decide, right? Then Jinnah withdrew his acceptance of cabinet mission and called the Muslim to observe the Direct Action Day on 16th of August 1946, when the Great Calcutta killing took place. These are the events that took place. So, I mean, if Pakistan were the last word in the mind of Jinnah, then why should he opt for cabinet mission plan? And one has got to answer, one has got to address this. So, in my understanding, that Congress leadership, I mean, 76% by and large constituted non-Muslims in India, and only 24%. And what was the bargaining point of Jinnah? That we the Muslim constitute 24%, but you please allow 1/3 representation in the Central Assembly. Congress long-term goal was Akhand Bharat, I mean, undivided India. Undivided India. But long-term goal was undivided India, but short-term strategy was majoritarian rule. Congress stand was you accept, in proportion to your number, that is 1/4, not 1/3. So if I am for united India, and in order to keep India united, then I think Congress should have been more pragmatic and generous. And Congress also failed to see the landscape. In other words, the geographical and democratic setting of then India, because there was Muslim concentration in the West, I mean in present West Pakistan, and Muslim concentration in the East, that is present Bangladesh, right? So we made a peace accord with the people in Chittagong Hill Tracts. They constitute not even 1%, 0.56%. But why should we make a peace accord with them? Because of their concentration, and they constitute a potential threat to our national integrity. That's why, in spite of their very, a small number, not to mention, the government signed a peace accord with them. Then the Congress should have seen the political map and the landscape and the demographic distribution of the then in India, that in the West, Muslim concentration, in the East, Muslim concentration. So these two regions constitute potential threat to the integrity of India. So they should have gone for a broader policy to accommodate the Muslim community, like Deshbandhu Chittoranjan Das, I mean C.R. Das, you know, he signed the Bengal Pact, and a leader of his stature, either C.R. Das or Netaji Subhash Chandra Bosu, they, they understood the problems in Puba perspective. But the Congress leadership, particularly at preceding partition, Nehru and Patel, they exercised some kind of veto power, you know, and that finally, resulted in the partition of India. This is how do I think?
Right.
My last point. I have one more. I have one more point. Just I mentioned. I will not elaborate. That the Bengali view of Pakistan was something different. It was not the state that came to be in 1947. That was not the view of a state of Abul Hashim, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and two others like them. They thought in terms of 1940 Lahore Resolution. And what does the Lahore Resolution suggest? That independent states, I mean, there will be one state in the Muslim majority region in present Pakistan, another state in the eastern zone, I mean eastern region, that is present Bangladesh and adjoining areas. So that was their understanding. And in pursuance of 1940 Lahore resolution, then Sohrawardi initiated the move for a united and independent Bengal. And Sohrawardi wrote a letter to Liaquat Ali Khan in the year 1947, 21st May, that, well, I have initiated the move for united independent Bengal. And this is our understanding of the ideal of Pakistan. We never thought of Pakistan in terms of a single or one state comprising two wings being separated by 1,000 miles. Not that. And that was also the understanding of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. That's why he was associated with the move for united independent Bengal. But it did not come true, or it was not materialized. Again, Zinia was agreeable to the proposition of united Bengal at a certain length of time. And what was the position of the British government? I have discussed all this in my foreshadowing of Bangladesh in the last chapter in details, you know, that British government said, well, if the two high commands agree, then there will be a third independent state, that is Bengal. And there are the two drafts. One, if only two states, India and Pakistan. And another draft, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, 3 states. And I have gone through the record in Indo-Official Library and record, right? It was there till 2nd June 1947, right?
Okay, well,
so
thank you very much, Professor.
You have to I mean, go beyond 1947 and what was the Pakistan ideal of the Bengal Muslim. You have to understand it in perspective. Then you'll be able to understand why Pakistan did not survive.
Good. Well, thank you, Professor Harun-or-Rashid. And I should have indeed mentioned the main title of a book, Foreshadowing of Bangladesh, because that actually indicates the main theme and arguments of your book. Well, this is a very good segue to bring in Professor Yaqoob Khan Bangash from Lahore. Professor Bangash, as you were listening to Professor Rashid, and he was saying that the Bengali Muslims who were fighting quite energetically for the establishment of Pakistan, but nonetheless, they had their own ideas about what their country would be like. And if I come back to Professor Devji's argument that Mr. Jinnah was, in a sense, asking Pakistanis to forget history and start afresh, but for the Bengali Muslims, it was difficult to forget their history. There's a long history of economic exploitation. There's a lot, the heritage of the Bengali culture and language and all of that. So there was a lot of history there as well. And a lot of this started being manifested in the years immediately after the establishment of Pakistan, including in the debates around the constitution, which was being written. And this is something that you are currently doing a lot of interesting work on. So I'd like you to pick up the threads from there and maybe give us a flavor of what you're finding in that research.
Great, thank you, Mahmud Saab, and I'm so happy to be in this very august forum with senior scholars here. I just have a couple of things to add to the discussion. Just in terms of partition, I'll make a couple of points, and then of course about the Constituent Assembly. The first thing that I really want to sort of talk about is that, you know, continuing on from what Professor Devji said about Pakistan as this kind of a new idea that's kind of divorced a bit from history. That's very much true about Jinnah, as he's explained in his book in Muslim Zion. They didn't really care about what had gone before, but he was really looking forward to what is going to come. And I think that's where the real complication is. What was going to come? Because if you divorce a country's existence and a country's creation from a firm anchor in history, what is going to happen? So I think that kind of remained a very vital and an important question. But just also on the point of partition, because of course the title of this talk was 74 years since partition. A lot of our understanding of partition is also based on hindsight. We have seen that the partition has happened in a particular way. That doesn't mean that it was supposed to happen in that particular way. A lot of the speakers here have mentioned that before the partition, a lot of different ideas were actually thought. As Faisal was actually talking about that, it was a dispute between two brothers. That's how Jinnah kind of saw it. But that didn't mean that the brothers won't really talk to each other or won't really kind of interact with each other afterwards. And if you look at whatever happened before the 15th of August, even in the conversations between the soon-to-be independent governments of India and Pakistan, there is a lot of understanding that the conversation will go on. And in fact, one of the other things that I'm working on is having another look at the partition at the moment. And fascinating things actually have come up there, which clearly show that it wasn't, the 15th of August wasn't this big rupture that everyone kind of now thinks. It took a long time, of course, as people like Wazir Zamindar have spoken about the long partition, but the expectation wasn't that, everything will kind of fall apart and it would be this great antagonism between India and Pakistan. It so happened that the conditions were such that it happened. One example that I've recently worked on, and my article is just coming out in Modern Nation Studies on this, is the Punjab Partition Committee. There were these two committees about Punjab and Bengal, different from the Boundary Commission. That just decided the boundary, but then there was these partition committees that actually decided on the division of these two great provinces. And I look at the Punjab one, and what I found, which was really fascinating, was a great deal of agreement between the political leaders and between the civil servants of these two places. And these continue for a long time. Even after partition, they actually continue. It's only after the massacres, it's only after the Kashmir dispute appears that there is great antagonism and things begin to fall apart. Before that, a lot of things are really working, and there is, to a large extent, some goodwill. And I think this is something that was expected. It wasn't expected that, all of a sudden these two countries are going to be created and they're never going to talk to each other and actually fight each other. Even Jinnah said that a number of times when, again, continuing on from Faisal's work, that when the two nations sort of theory comes up, that Hindus and Muslims are nations and they need to deal with each other with upon this basis rather than majority and minority, the idea wasn't that there'll be two antagonistic nations. So I think one thing which we need to understand is that the killings that happened, no one really anticipated that. They should have, now we know, but at that time, people weren't really expecting that. The great exodus of people weren't really expecting that 15 million people at least on the Punjab side are going to change sides. So all these things kind of happened post partition, and I think we need to kind of understand it in that perspective. So that that's a bit about the partition. Now coming to the Constituent Assembly, one of the most fascinating things is that when you're creating a new country, what basis on which you actually create a new country? And one of the things that I found really interesting was that where in India, by 1950, they've had their constitution, and on the 26th of January, they actually promulgated. Pakistan, it takes 9 long years because there's no agreement over what Pakistan actually means, what it should be. But what's really interesting is the place of religion, and I think that is something that has kind of mired our understanding of Pakistan, because even Jinnah himself wasn't clear. And I wrote this paper a couple of years ago on just trying to understand what Jinnah was saying. Everyone quotes the August 11th speech of Jinnah, where he gives this very liberal idea of Pakistan, of equality. But what's really interesting is that he also gives lots of other ideas of Pakistan. So for example, when he was chairing the session of the All India Muslim League Council in December 1947, he actually said this, and I quote, "Let it be clear that Pakistan is going to be a Muslim state based on Islamic ideals." Then in the next month, in January 1948, when he's speaking to the Karachi Bar Association, he said, "I cannot understand that a section of the people who deliberately want to create mischief and make propaganda that the Constitution of Pakistan would not be based on the Shariat." So Jinnah, after the creation of Pakistan, has a lot of references about Islam, lots of mentions that it will be based on Islamic ideals. Now, of course, the question is what Islamic ideals, and again, for that, I think you have to read Faisal's book, go back to Muslim Zion, because that ideal of Jinnah is all about Islamic modernism. It is all about this very modern and this very forward-looking view of Islam. And one example of that, if I can give, is Jinnah gives this interview just a couple of weeks before independence, and the interviewer asks him that what kind of an Islam are you really going to see in Pakistan? And he gives the example, and and I really find it fascinating that he gave the example of parda. Parda amongst women, veiling, was a big thing amongst Indian Muslims. And at that time, of course, it was pretty much a big deal. But Jinnah is very interesting. What Jinnah says then is, oh, parda is a thing of the past, because in the old days you needed parda because the king could take off with any beautiful woman. But in the modern democratic society, you don't really need those kinds of things, and these are already on the way out. So Jinnah was a very modern Muslim, thinker in that way. And again, he thought of Muslims as this new community. So yes, he used Islamic rhetoric, yes, he used Islamic ideals, but the interpretation that Jinnah had of them was very, very modern. And I think that is something that kind of set Jinnah apart from a lot of the other people that were there. Now, when it comes to the Constituent Assembly, Jinnah is only there for 1 year. He dies, within 13 months of the creation of Pakistan. And this is when this whole thing kind of then blows up, and there is no agreement over what Jinnah wanted. Now, one of the most fascinating things in this that I worked on in a bit of detail, and even a couple of years ago published an article on it, is the infamous Objectives Resolution of March 1949. And that's really, really, really fascinating because, well, one is that there are so many myths about it that it's completely fascinating that, what people think about it. But what's one very interesting thing about that is that when the Objectives Resolution was even presented, over just about half of the Constituent Assembly wasn't even present. And, people like Nurul Islam from East Bengal had already gone back to Dhaka. So you actually, it was introduced at a time there weren't that many people around, and it was just kind of thrown in. But that kind of became the defining feature of the Constitution of Pakistan, and that kind of framed the polity that Pakistan was going to be. And in that discussion, it's really fascinating where it ends up very much on communal lines. So you've got the Hindu members of the Constituent Assembly, which are all from East Pakistan. They are part of the Pakistan National Congress, opposing the Objectives Resolution, and all of the Muslim members supporting it, be it they're from East Pakistan or from West Pakistan. And what's really fascinating about this debate on the Objectives Resolution is that what are the principles upon which Pakistan will be created? Will they be completely Muslim principles that people who are Muslims or who actually have knowledge of Islamic ideals or Islamic theology or Islamic ethics, they are going to elucidate? Or is it going to be the Constituent Assembly which itself is going to do it? And here it was very interesting that a number of leaders of the Pakistan National Congress said that, well, Jinnah, promised us in the August 11th speech equal citizenship and everything. And what are you talking about here, that everything is going to be seen through an Islamic lens? That's when practically the Deputy Prime Minister of Pakistan, Sadat Abdul Rabb Nishtar, rises up and says that, in fact, if Jinnah promised minorities a lot of things, and I think that this is a very key point here, that if Jinnah promised the minorities a lot of things, he also promised the majority a lot of things. And he promised the majority an Islamic nation, which, of course, he wanted to interpret. And what kind of an Islamic nation? So, what I really want to show is the trajectory from Jinnah in the 1940s or even in 1947 to what happened by 1949. And what's really fascinating is that by 1949, the idea of what Pakistan should be has moved on to a large extent from what Jinnah was actually talking about. It has moved on into a very non-modernist Islamic interpretation of what Jinnah was actually talking about and what Pakistan stood for. So I'll just give you one example there in the interest of time. Maulana Shabir Usmani, who was this Islamic scholar that even actually Jinnah himself had asked to come in and join Pakistan's Constituent Assembly from India. When he rose up to speak in the debate on the Objectives Resolution, this is what he said, and I quote, "An Islamic state is not a state in its own rights, with authority inherent in it. It is a state to which authority has been delegated. The real sovereignty belongs to God. Man is the vice-regent on earth and discharges his obligation in this respect alone, with other religious duties on the principle of a state within the limits prescribed by God." So Shabir Usmani, when he talks about an Islamic country, he defines it in very purely Muslim theological terms. Another scholar at that time, Dr. O.H. Malik, who is the Vice Chancellor of Punjab University and a member of the Constituent Assembly, he actually calls Pakistan theo-democracy. and this is very interesting in the debate, what he actually says is, oh, well, it is actually theo-democracy, God-led democracy, but since it's not a fashionable term, I'm going to say Islamic democracy. So you see very quickly a whole sort of new idea that kind of emerges about what Pakistan was going to be. And I think the conflict, therefore, that remains in terms of Pakistan is that, you know, Jinnah created it with a particular view of Islam, with a particular view of history, which was no history really to that extent. And in fact, you know, just as a footnote, there's no idea of territory also. You know, one of the other things that actually Faisal very interestingly points out in his work is that, you know, Jinnah didn't really care where Pakistan was physically. You know, it could be anywhere, which again leads to so many questions, because, you know, a country needs to have a territory eventually. But it's that ideal of Jinnah which actually created the country to what then happens in 1949, which is a complete reinterpretation of what Jinnah was actually talking about. And those are the other conditions that then create the seed of dissension amongst the people in Pakistan, and create such seminal questions that, you know, do not get answered for 9 years, but then in fact do not get answered ever, because in 1971 there's a civil war and the split of Pakistan, and even now Pakistan is going through all these problems. But here, let me, since we have been talking a lot about East Pakistan and East Bengal, let me also highlight that one of the things about East Bengal was that even though the Muslim League was really popular there, the Muslim League actually, even in the 1937 election, that is where the Muslim League actually got most of its votes, and in 46 also. What had actually changed was the reality of the Bengali leadership had actually changed by that time. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one is Professor Harun-or-Rashid mentioned about the Lahore resolution, but in 1946, the Muslim League Council had amended it and changed independent states to independent state, you know, which basically meant that you will ask for one country rather than multiple countries. So that was one, I think, big indication that, you know, Bengal was probably never going to get independent. Secondly, and this really comes through the Constituent Assembly debates, is that the elite of Bengal, you know, people like Khwaja Nazmuddin or Khwaja Shahabuddin, you know, from the Dhaka Nawab's family, are actually Urdu speaking. You know, they are not Bengali speaking. Yes, the person might be the Nawab of Dhaka and all of that, but he is not a Bengali speaker. And I think that is what happens in the whole debate, that the people who actually talk about Bengal are Hindus, Hindu Bengalis, and very soon, therefore, it ends up being again a Muslim versus a Hindu thing, rather than a Bengali versus a Pakistani, an East Pakistani versus a West Pakistani thing. That develops much later in the 1950s, when people like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and all that come up, and then, you know, the United Front is actually created in 1954. But I think the question of the Muslim elite of Bengal being actually, you know, very much hand in glove with the elite of West Pakistan is a point that I think must be understood, because one should not forget that even though Jinnah said that Urdu shall be the national language and the official language of Pakistan eventually, Khwaja Nazmuddin, when he became the Governor General, reiterated that. And Khwaja Nazmuddin was, you know, from the family of the Nawab of Bengal. So it wasn't that it was Jinnah that was talking about it, or Jinnah wanted to, you know, create it in a particular manner. You have the former premier of East Bengal really saying that also. So I think that's one very important factor that really needs to be looked in there. The last point that I really just want to mention is that one of the other problems which I really saw in the Constituent Assembly, and this is something that, you know, is really fascinating, that the Constituent Assembly was the only place where East and West Pakistan actually spoke to each other. There was no other forum. You know, it was the only place where these two sides came and had a discussion. And what I really found fascinating when I began working on it, that there wasn't a single book that was completely dedicated to looking at this assembly, because there was no other forum. And I think that is what created and exacerbated a number of problems between East and West Pakistan, because you did not have so many joint initiatives. You did not have, you know, joint things, except for this assembly, which from day one was bogged down with the idea of what Pakistan will be, was not able to decide about its Islamic ideals, or about, you know, how East and West Pakistan are going to agree in terms of power sharing. And, you know, it was bogged down with these issues so much that no other issues were really discussed thoroughly. You know, one of the fascinating things, if I can point out here, is that in the constitution making process, economics wasn't discussed. You know, there's this only a very small reference in the Constituent Assembly when it's talking about the Constitution itself about property rights. But except for that, it doesn't talk economics at all. So you could see that the singular focus then becomes to defining the nature of Pakistan, and that then becomes very contested and leads to further debates and leads to further arguments between not just East and West Pakistan, but also, and I should footnote this, also between different provinces of West Pakistan. You know, this is often kind of undermined that whereas there was an East Pakistani opposition there was also a very strong West Pakistani opposition after the creation of one unit. The smaller provinces did not like to be joined together as West Pakistan. All the princely states, you know, something which I worked on in another life, they didn't like to be all meshed up in the one unit scheme. So, you know, bottom line is that, you know, this Constituent Assembly debate, I think, really provides us with a very fascinating look over the first sort of 10 years of both the development of East and West Pakistan, and what kind of questions are actually emerging, especially about the nature of Pakistan, about what kind of polity it is, also about what kind of relations will it have with India, because, you know, whereas in West Pakistan there was more of a building antagonism towards in India, you know, the borders in East Pakistan were very porous till 1965, and it's only in 1965, a very interesting argument could actually be presented that it's actually the 1965 war between India and Pakistan that actually finishes the partition, because that is when actual connection between Pakistan and India is broken, trade relations are broken, films are actually banned in each other's countries. So you actually have this very long phase where a lot of things are going back and forth, and then eventually kind of a separation begins to happen between Pakistan and India. By that time, of course, the whole separation has emerged between East and West Pakistan.
Thank you very much. That was a very fascinating account, Professor Bangash. And as you said,
I have a comment with Akhtar Ahmad.
Yes, I was just going to come to you in a moment, but I just wanted to say that, as Professor Bangash was saying, religious was very much in the foreground of the discussion at that time. And you also mentioned the language issue, and you did say that economics was not discussed much in the Constituent Assembly. And what I'm going to do is, because we have to go into the question and answer session, we are not going into the second round of discussions with the panel, but I would still like to take 2 or 3 minutes to bring Professor Islam back into the discussion, because he was not only an observer, but was a direct participant in the discussions and debates about economic disparity in the 50s and 1960s. So, Professor Islam, can I just ask you to tell us a little bit about the whole debate and discussion on economic disparity that you were yourself a frontline participant of? If you could just take 2 or 3 minutes, and I know that you were trying to react to something, but if you can just take 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will open up the floor.
Dr. Mahmood, I have also some questions to Dr. Yaqoob Khan.
Okay, when we go into the after session, maybe you can pose your questions then.
That's two, three questions. Yes.
Okay, but let's give the floor to Professor Islam.
Please.
Yes. I'm totally overwhelmed by the fast, rapid, huge speech by Dr. Yaqoob. Now I see why the domination of West by East of East by West was such a reality. I can see it's impossible. It speaks too much and too fast. I can barely understand what was he saying. Now, the question was that, what did Akhtar, you asked me a question about economics.
Yes.
Economics of what?
It is. Well, as Professor Bangash said, that the economics was not much discussed in the Constituent Assembly, but outside the Assembly and beyond the passing of the Constitution in the 50s and 1960s, of course, there was a lot of discussion and debate on economic disparity and the idea.
I'm not sure what does it mean by Constituent Assembly, between 1949 and 55 or what?
Yes.
What do you mean? It's a long period, and there are very significant differences in various periods. What do you mean Constituent Assembly?
Let's discuss about the economic disparity issue briefly, because you were a
economic disparity. it was not economic disparity. In 1955, the issue was raised by East Pakistani economists in a conference of Pakistan Economic Association, saying that Pakistan cannot be treated as one economy. Why? It is 1,100 miles separated by another country, very little mobility of labor and capital, and the cost of air flight between East and West was several times higher than the per capita income of East, and via Sri Lanka is even more. So the whole thing is not a viable situation to run as a single unit. It has to be run as a loose confederation. And that was the thesis we propounded in 1955. That was rejected outright or even discussed by others in West Pakistan. That is the very serious problem, which I don't think any of the discussions even looked at it. The question of that these two parts of Pakistan were not one economy. This was never realized by any of the discussions in this year's seminar here and also in political discussions. This cannot be run as one country in terms of economic policies. The central government has very limited functions. It's all decentralized to the two parts. This was rejected outright and opposed seriously by West. Any question?
So no, but I'll just see in a sense.
Our participants will react.
Yes, we'll open up the floor in a moment. But I guess what you're saying.
Can I just ask one or two questions to Dr. Yaqoob Khan?
Yes, why don't you?
Yes, please. First question.
Can I add something from London?
First.
Let Professor Rashid finish the question, and then we will open up the floor for further questions. Maybe we'll take 3 or 4 questions in one go, and then let the panelists answer, and then we'll take another round.
So, may I take the floor? First, well, why should it take 9 years to frame a constitution for Pakistan, which lasted only for 2.5 years? One. And why should the language movement take place in the year 1948 and also in 1952? From the Bengali point of view, it was not the question whether Pakistan will be an Islamic state or non-Islamic state or what brand of Islam, etc., etc. The bone of contention was it was one state but two countries. As Professor Islam said, that there cannot be one economy. Again, Bengalis, they constitute a different and distinct national category in terms of language, history, heritage, etc., etc. You said, well, constitution was, my point is, there was a parity agreement. The Bengalis, they constituted 56% of the population, but Jinnah made the pronouncement in Dhaka that Urdu and Urdu shall be the state language of Pakistan, and that was protested in that meeting. And you said there was hardly any discussion about economic disparity in the Constituent Assembly. I would rather beg to differ that in the year 1948, February, Shaista Ikramullah in Constituent Assembly mentioned that there is a growing thing among the Bengalis that they have become a colony of West Pakistanis. They have become a colony of West Pakistanis. And if you follow the speeches of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in the second Constituent Assembly, you will see that, well, he dealt with the economic disparity between the two wings categorically. And, well, you said that West Pakistani provinces, they did not want one unit. Then why one unit was created? It was simply to confront the Bengalis or East Pakistan.
Thank you, Professor Rashid.
And finally, finally, you said the 1970 was a civil war. I would like to not only differ, rather mark of protest. I would like to record it was not a civil war. It was a war of liberation on the part of the Bengalis against the Pakistani occupation army, because it constituted a different entity, a different nationhood. And we are talking about two-nation theory. What is two-nation theory? It was a framework of a united movement. Even Jinnah did not define two-nation theory.
Professor Rashid, I got your point. I think for the interest of time, let's open it up. I got your point.
Finally, excuse me, you said Khaza Nazimuddin, while he was the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he also uttered that Urdu will be the state language of Pakistan. But I hope you also know that Khaza Nazimuddin, throughout his political career, was never ever an elected leader. All the time, either he was picked up by Jinnah or elected without. And their family, they came from Kashmir. They are not Bengalis. They are Urdu speaking. So they did not represent the Bengali Muslims.
Yeah,
they did not represent Bengal.
We got the point. Let's open up.
They did not represent Bengal.
It would be for everyone who's asking the questions to ask a question, not a comment, and please keep it very brief. We'll take 2 or 3 questions in this round, and then we'll go back to the panelists. I think there was somebody trying to ask a question before
Ismail.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm a student at Cambridge University studying history. My question is for all of the panel. I think something that hasn't necessarily been brought up that much is that if you were to look at the sort of the step towards independence, I read India Wins Freedom by Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad recently, who is obviously an Indian but a Muslim, rather like me. And his argument, I think, was very much that in the political steps leading up to freedom and the establishment of Pakistan, there was an attempt, on the one hand by Gandhi, on the other hand, which I dispute, but he nonetheless says it, by Jinnah, to sort of come to a compromise and say, okay, let's not split into 2 nations. But that there was Vallabhbhai Patel on the one hand, and there was Nehru on the other hand, who did subscribe to the 2-nation theory. So I suppose what I'm trying to ask is there's been a lot of discussion about how Pakistan was sort of adhered to the 2-nation theory on the part of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But I don't think there's been enough discussion about the part played on that theory by Vallabhbhai Patel and the sort of hardcore Indian, perhaps even proto-RSS nationalists. Vallabhbhai Patel has been notoriously sort of deified by Modi and his supporters. So yeah, just that, I suppose.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Sorry, if anyone has any more questions, could you please let us know now so we can have 3 or 4 together and then we'll answer them together.
I have a question, if I may.
Please.
Yeah. So so I think Jawaharlal Nehru, when he was interviewed by a French journalist, he was asked, "What has been your greatest challenge as Prime Minister?" He said, "Creating a secular state in a religious country." If we look at India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, one thing is obvious: secularism is on the fall. So, do the panelists think that the South Asian history, culture, or the way we live, or practice religion, it will be very difficult to establish secular liberal democracy in South Asia?
Okay, I know there are some more questions coming, but let's go back to the panel with these 3 sets of questions. Maybe Professor Bangash, could you come in first? You had a barrage of questions with a comment from Professor Islam, but also a few questions from Professor Harun-or-Rashid, and then you may also want to respond to the other 2 questions that have been posed. Yaqoob Khan Bangash.
Yes. Well, thank you for those questions, and as Professor Nurul Islam actually said, that it was 1955 when those economists actually kind of came up with that, how there was a big disparity between the two wings of Pakistan, and that, clearly shows through that it was, a bit later, 7 to 8 years after the creation of Pakistan, that argument became clearer. But just to answer to what Professor Harun-or-Rashid was actually saying, when I said the Constituent Assembly, I meant the Constitution, and I even said that, the Constitution-making body of it. So the Constituent Assembly was actually a very confusing kind of a body, because it was two things. It was the Constituent Assembly constitution-making body, and then it was the Constituent Assembly legislature. So what you have quoted is from the legislature part, where Shah Saik Ramullah and lots of other people actually mentioned, a lot of the Pakistan National Congress members kind of mentioned the economic disparity thing. But those were topical issues. Those were reactions to what was happening. What I was talking about is that in terms of making the constitution, so on the constituent side, assembly side, where it's the constitution making side, there was very little reference of economics, and there was a in fact about 90% of the time was actually focused on two issues, which was the parity between East and West Pakistan and religion. So that is what I was actually pointing out. Not that no one spoke about economics on the legislature side of the Pakistan Assembly. Of course, lots of questions of economics were raised and discussed, and of course that's where the finance bill is and the budget is introduced. So of course there were economic questions there, but in the constituent side that was not the case, and I think I found that really fascinating, because one needs to talk about relations between all sides. On the question of there was another question about about partition and about it happening, and was it what Aisha Jalal's argument about making it one or not. I think one of the things that really one has to look at there is, and perhaps there I would say that one should begin reading from what Farzana Sheikh's actually first book was about, the idea of community that kind of emerges amongst North Indian Muslims. It would have been very hard for nothing dramatic to have happened in 1947. I really think that something would have happened. It could have had another shape, but something would have happened, because the way the Muslim League was developing, from 1940 onwards, the way Jinnah was actually talking about, enough time had elapsed that Jinnah just could not pull the plug at the last minute. A lot of the imagination had actually been done there. So I think that is something that we must be aware of, that it wasn't very easy that, when push comes to shove, that, Jinnah will say, oh, fine, I'm happy living together with the rest of you. So I think that needs to be kept in mind. Of course, hindsight is 2020. Maybe he could have said this, or maybe he could have had something else. We don't know, but, that's one way of looking at it. And on the very important, I think, point that I think Tawheed Ismail spoke about, Vallabhbhai Patel, I think that's a very important thing, because, even the idea of the two-nation theory actually does not go back to Jinnah or even Iqbal for that matter. It goes back to, Lala Lajpat Rai. Who actually decades earlier was actually talking about Hindus and Muslims as two different nations. So in fact, actually the idea of two-nation theory, to some extent, not completely, but to some extent, comes in from Hindutva. And Lala Lajpat Rai, was kind of a forerunner of Hindutva ideals, which Vallabhbhai Patel also kind of followed. So I think there is an important trajectory there that one should not discount. Yes, it was the Muslim League there, but we also had this very strong proto-Hindutva, perhaps one can say, trajectory there, which again wasn't seen in those light, in this light at that time, but that is what it really was. And of course, we have the Hindu Mahasabha there also, a purely Hindu majoritarian party. So all these trends are there, and they kind of come together. But one footnote which I really want to say to all these questions is that one of the other things, well, two things that we haven't really spoken about here is one is India, because there's been very little mention of India itself, so we have mentioned Pakistan and Bangladesh, but there was India also, the huge country that actually did get independence. So I think that's, that needs to be highlighted. And the big elephant in the room is the British. No one has really mentioned that. And I will say that, a lot there is also the role of Lord Mountbatten. So not just the British, generally as the establishment, but Mountbatten himself is, I think, to be blamed to a large extent over what happened and how things happened. And if you read Andrew Roberts and his take on Mountbatten as compared to Philip Ziegler's, who was the official biographer, I think Roberts gets it right. It was the perils of adrenaline that even someone like Stanley Wolpert also agrees that it was the rush, it was the shameful flight, to use Churchill's words, that led to a lot of the conflict afterwards. So I think one needs to also keep in mind that there was this very overconfident and someone in a rush, a guy called Lord Mountbatten, that had complete power over the future of India. So I think that's one ingredient that we shouldn't forget also.
Thank you. Professor Devji, would you like to respond to the questions? And if you have any response to what Professor Bangash just said, please go ahead.
Well, since Yaqoob mentioned Lala Lajpat Rai, it's interesting to note that as early as the 1930s, he had suggested that the one reason why this issue was so intractable is because the constitutional history of British India had already folded in parties and populations into legal identities that had not only become established, but that were impossible to remove without a kind of criminal act, if you will. He suggested that perhaps the only thing that could restart relations, communal relations and political relations in India would be a civil war. Now, that's quite an interesting statement to make already in the 1930s. And I would like to go back to my earlier comment on the figure of civil war, because it's a figure that continues to haunt the language of partition. As I suggested earlier, partition is a British term that comes in and that is received rather differently in vernacular languages. Civil war is a term that both Iqbal and Gandhi used to describe what is actually happening in India towards the end of the 1930s and into the 1940s. A communal civil war, they called it. Now, what partition did is to forestall that civil war, is to make sure that the logic of partition, the legal logic of partition, however violent, took over. And so the civil war was displaced to some degree, or it was domesticated in some other way. Of course, it comes back in 1971 with the emergence of Bangladesh. And what I find interesting about that is not simply that the civil war that had been spoken of from the time of Lala Lajpat Rai down to Iqbal and Gandhi finally received its fulfillment in 1971, but rather that what the civil war does in its return is to close the history or the logic of partition. Yaqoob interestingly mentioned how the War of 1965 seems to have done that because it shut off relations between India and Pakistan. But what 1971 does in addition is to finally draw a line under the communal conflict that had made partition possible in this sense. So we know, and my former student Ria Kapoor has written her thesis on this, on the refugee movement in 1971 between what was then East Pakistan and India. 12 million people, the equivalent number who were displaced in partition, came from East Pakistan to India during the War of 1971. At that point, the government of India refused to invoke the old history of partition and the old history of British India. So Bangladesh was seen as a separate country. It was no longer considered part of the spoils of partition or part of the, as it were, effects of partition. And as far as I can tell, but I'm sure my Bangladeshi colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, the partition of India does not play a crucial role in Bangladeshi nationalism. Bangladesh is a new country which has its own history. Its history is not necessarily, of course, it results from the history of partition and the history of British India, but unlike India and Pakistan, which are post-colonial states, Bangladesh is not in that sense a post-colonial state. The result of a civil war, it is a state that has opposed itself to the post-colonial state, i.e. to the state of Pakistan. And in that sense, it changes everything. So Bangladesh has its own historical logic. It is truly an independent state in that sense. It is not part of the logic of India and Pakistan with their continuing narrative of communal conflict. If anything, we can see what happens in 1971 as the closing. If the post-colonial state emerged in South Asia in 1947, India and Pakistan were the first post-colonial states after the United States, right? Given independence from Britain. In 1971, you have the end of the logic of the post-colonial state because Bangladesh is not manifestly a post-colonial state. Bangladesh begins a new iteration of freedom, globally speaking. So I think between 1947 and 71, some very important things happen. India and Pakistan remain, as it were, bound together in this fashion. Bangladesh begins its own logic, but perhaps in that sense, Bangladesh is able to put in place a set of processes and procedures that have not yet become possible for India and Pakistan. So we know that Bangladesh and India have had, however imperfectly, a set of agreements as to restitution for refugees, for people who were expelled, for people who were forced to leave, right? Dealing very often with Hindu refugees. That, despite Gandhi's insistence that that should be the case for India and Pakistan, has not yet become the case. And I wonder if Gandhi was correct in thinking that the only way in which the ghost of partition can be laid to rest, and the only medium for this laying to rest, is by the processes of the right to return of refugees or their descendants, and restitution on both sides, on the Indian side and on the Pakistani side. This is a manageable population, and it is a population that should have, in Gandhi's view already in 1948, been made not the great antagonist of Indo-Pakistani against Indo-Pakistani peace, but rather the bridge between them. This can only happen in Gandhi's view if there is a right to return of some kind, special visa regimes, let's say, and on the other, a deliberate attempt at restitution, however imperfect that is, because no one can give back the lives that have been lost and the suffering that has been incurred. But that is a starting point, and it is a starting point that Bangladesh and India have already made with one another.
Thank you very much. We'll open up for just one more round of questions, but let me also, there's a question on the table, because that was also part of the subject today, is now after 73, 74 years of partition.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes, please, just let me finish this question. So how do the countries look at each other? I know that Professor Bangash has spoken on this. I've seen a couple of YouTube videos on how India is perceived in Pakistan, and we can ask the question of the other countries, how Pakistan is perceived in India, or both Pakistan and India are perceived in Bangladesh. I'll just place that question on the table if you want to pick it up. But we first had, what I can see here, the name is Charlton HK. I would ask that person to go first, and then Mr. Syed was trying to ask a question, so I'll go to him for that. So, but let's go to Charlton HK.
Yeah, so my first question is to Professor Devji, which is that, do you think that these concepts of contract, of parity, and of sovereign equality as a negotiating basis are linked to the breakdown of the personal side of relationships, the personal and the political, bilaterally between Jinnah and Gandhi? And my question for Yaqoob is where do the smaller minorities fit into this construction of two new homelands, two new states? Can we try and fit them into the picture? And then I would just quickly add one last thing, which is that by framing the partition as a distinct process, we sort of adopt the American view of what a civil war is, where it's two entities that look like states or that look like clear entities. But it isn't a lot of partition violence very much like the messier civil conflicts that you see in places like Syria.
Thank you. And can I have the question from the gentleman who was trying to come in? Mr.
Said? Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is that today's discussion was on 47's partition, and partition was done due to the two nationalism theory, and that two nationals was Hindu and Muslims. And that partition was taken place and British colonial rule was getting off from that India subcontinent. That's correct. But how does this comes in Bangladesh on 47's partition? Bangladesh was not there, and Bangladesh was not a part of this partition. And somebody was trying to say that Bangladesh didn't want Pakistan, this and that. No, Bangladeshi people, they were Muslims and they wanted to be with the Pakistanis because they wanted this two nations theory. Why didn't they stay with India then? If they were that secular and they were not a Muslim oriented people. They were Muslim and they wanted to be a Muslim nations. And that's why they joined with Pakistan. Later on in 71, they have divided because they had some problems with Pakistanis. And Pakistan was not ruled by politicians. Pakistan could have, if Pakistan would have been ruled by politicians, then the scenario would have been different. Pakistan was ruled by military junta, and that's why Bangladeshi politicians took that opportunity to crack on that thing. And that's why Bangladesh was born. And Bangladesh was born, it is their quality. They're born from Pakistan, that's fine, but Bangladesh was not a part of India-Pakistan dividation. And in 47, Bangladesh never ever said, we want to be in India or we want to be liberated. They never said that because they were not a part at all. They were not a part at all. So there is no point that Bangladesh is pounding that we were the part and our leader has said, and somebody was talking about his leader, and that leader was not the leader at that time.
Okay, but do you have a question?
He led Bangladesh. I agree with him. He led Bangladesh. He was definitely provided a liberation war for Bangladesh. And that's fine, but he was not.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because the idea was to ask some questions, and if you had any comment, it had to be very, very brief. So anyway, we got your comment there. Is there any other question?
Yeah, I have one question.
Oh yes, Mr. Hussain, yes, please.
Yeah, it's in that Mr. Jinnah is blamed to be the originator of two-nation theory. But if we see, okay, I'm coming to the question directly. Why can't Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the Renaissance Assadar in Bengal or in India at large, the Bengali Bhadralok clan, literary figures like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay be blamed for propagating the seed of two-nation theory? Since Ram Mohan Roy's Renaissance was actually the religious reformation of the Hindus and there's no place of Muslims, Bankim's paving off an anti-Muslim hatred through literature like in his Bengali novel Ananda Math, and the maintaining of good relationship with the British by the English-educated Calcutta-centric Bengali Hindus founded the ideological establishment of anti-Muslim hatred, and later that Savarkar, Aurobindo-like figures implemented that in politics. How can they be ignored from blaming?
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Professor Devji, who I understand has to leave soon. In any case, we are going to end in about 6-7 minutes. But Professor Devji, would you go first?
Yes, just a couple of points. One is that it's very easy for us to retrospectively to see the history of 20th century India, British India, as being one of unrelieved conflict. And that was not the case. So let me remind everyone that as late as the 1920s, the early 1920s of the Khilafat movement, you have a situation in which the world's most important pan-Islamic movement, Khilafat, was led by a Hindu, a devout, practicing and pious Hindu like Mahatma Gandhi. He was asked by the Muslim leadership of India to take on this role. And that was not a problem. It was not a problem for anyone. So I'm not offering you this tidbit so as to, as a kind of gratifying example of communal harmony, but only so as to argue that we need not take what we ourselves have experienced in the last few decades as being inevitably the permanent state of affairs in our history. Let me give you another example. Some 10 years ago when I first arrived in Oxford, I had the dubious pleasure of having dinner with General Musharraf. And he asked me what I thought of partition, of course. And I said to him that the problem with the scholarship on partition until recently has been that it has become a blame game. And we see this among some of the questions here today. You can blame the British, you can blame the Congress, or you can blame the League. These are the three major figures. And you can replace the League and the Congress by Muslims and Hindus if you so desire. There's also a fourth figure who was very much present at the time in terms of a blame game, the Sikhs of the Punjab. When you look at, Yaqoob will be familiar with this, when you look at the early Pakistani coverage of partition as it is happening, you have a great deal of attention paid to the Sikhs, who are seen falsely, let me add, as being responsible for beginning the violence in the Punjab, and that the Hindus and Muslims are actually perfectly willing to resolve their issues. So I mentioned this to Musharraf to show that even such a ridiculous, hackneyed and plain wrong idea of partition seen in terms of who was responsible for it, even that ridiculous vision has some complexity to it. Because today the idea of the Sikh as the instigator, primary instigator of violence is nowhere to be seen, and that is a good thing. But the important point to note is that our obsession with responsibility itself has a history, and it has a history that is significantly different from what we tend to think of it today. So I myself would set aside all of these futile debates on who was responsible for what and why. In 1939, Savarkar, the Hindu nationalist, stood beside Jinnah and Ambedkar, the Dalit leader, against the Congress. When Congress went out of power, when it resigned office with the beginning of the Second World War. And when this happened, Gandhi wrote to Jinnah and said, look, I'm really glad, even though I'm associated with Congress, that the three of you have come together. Maybe you will together position movement that will be capable of taking on the Congress, and perhaps it will be you who will form the first independent government of India. So from 1920 to 1939, you have these strange possibilities that seem strange to us only in retrospect. So, one of the questioners wants to blame Savarkar for partition, but here we have Savarkar standing alongside Jinnah and Ambedkar. There were all kinds of possibilities open at the time. There was no inevitability, though there was also, of course, violence. And the only way we can actually deal with the issue of partition is to understand it in all its complexity and its nuance, and not play a blame game.
Thank you very much, Professor Devji. I'll go to Professor Harun-or-Rashid just for brief responses to any of the questions that you'd like, and then we'll go to Professor Bangash, and then if Professor Islam has any final comments, we'll go to him. So Professor Rashid. Is he muted? I can see everyone has been muted.
So you have to unmute yourself, Professor Harun.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, as I see Jinnah's two nations theory or two nations theory as such, I don't think that it has a scientific basis. It was a framework for united movement to unite the Indian Muslims who were internally diverse. And well, even Jinnah came out with the statement as Dr. Yaqoob Khan mentioned on 11th August 1947, before the formal or official declaration of establishing Pakistan, that today's Hindus would cease to be Hindus, Muslims would cease to be Muslims, we all are Pakistanis, right? So Jinnah disowned his own two-nation theory. As a matter of fact, it was a political framework, not an article of faith, or it has got any scientific basis. If so, then how to explain the emergence of Bangladesh? One. Next, how to explain the move for united independent Bengal in 1947, preceding 1947 partition. And when Jinnah came to meet with Lord Mountbatten on 26th of April 1947, Lord Mountbatten put the question straight to Jinnah that Sohrabji wanted united independent Bengal. What is your position or reaction? Jinnah said, well, I shall be delighted. Let Bengal remain united in an independent. They have common culture, history, language, and etc., etc. Mr. Yaqoob said that 1940 Lahore Resolution was amended in 1946 Muslim Legislators Convention. The resolution was adopted at the annual session of All India Muslim League, and the Muslim Legislators Convention had no legal or political right to amend the party's resolution adopted in 1940. So I think that is totally misleading. Next, for the Bengalis in the state of Pakistan from 1947, it was not, well, economic disparity was important, but it was not number one agenda. Number one question was national persecution upon the Bengalis by the West Pakistanis. And that started with the language issue. That is, what will be the state language of Pakistan. The Bengalis' claim was that Bengali should have been one of the state languages of Pakistan, not the single one or only one language of state language of Pakistan. One of the state languages along with Urdu, but did the West Pakistani political leaders accept it? No. They said Urdu and Urdu would be the state language of Pakistan. So it was not because of military. Pakistan had been under military rule for quite a long time, and that resulted in partition or disintegration of Pakistan in 1971. It is not true. Even under the political regime and the rule of the political leadership, there were differences. And for the Bengalis, the main major concern was the question of national identity. And that Bengali distinct national identity did not resolve in the year 1947 through the creation of Pakistan. That's why Bengali had to fight for another 24 years under the leadership of our founding father, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And if you try to see history and the subsequent political events from that point of view, then it will explain that the emergence of Bangladesh. Otherwise, there cannot be a state all on a sudden, It has a history, and I fully agree with Dr. Devji that Bangladesh has its own logic. Even 1947 Pakistan was not the state vision of a section of Bengali leaders. Well, it might be the state vision of Khaja Nazimuddin, Shahabuddin, and others, but they were non-Bengalis like the West Pakistanis. But the son of the Shahs, like Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and a good number of people, they had a different view of Pakistan that was stipulated in the 1940 Lahore Resolution, that there should have been a different state here in the eastern belt of India, I'm meaning present Bangladesh. So it is not true that, well, Bengalis wanted to live with Pakistan state, but the Pakistani rulers mishandled or misgoverned. That's why Pakistan disintegrated. This is not true. I don't agree. Rather, as I the title of my work, book, is The Foreshadowing of Bangladesh. You might be knowing that even within Muslim League and Pakistan movement before 1947, there were tensions and disputes and disagreement between the Bengali and non-Bengali Muslim leadership along the issue of language and other questions. Bengalis constituted 56% of the total population. Why should you press hard for parity, 50-50? Unless the Bengalis agreed to that formula 50-50, there was no constitution in the state of Pakistan. When they agreed to 50-50, then there was a constitution. Again, it continued only for 2 years and a half. Then again, why there was one unit comprising 4 provinces of West Pakistan, just to confront the Bengalis. So from the very inception of the state of Pakistan, in the mind of the West Pakistani leadership and ruling regimes, that East Bengal is their colony. The colonial rulers, they came from the West. The businessmen, the industrialists, they came to Pakistan, to East Bengal for investment. So it became a colony, and it was categorically mentioned in the Constitutional Assembly by Shaista Mullah and others. And if you go through the speeches by Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in the Second Constituent Assembly during 1955 to 1958, you will see that what did he say there? That we will not agree to parity anymore. We want representation according to the number of our population, right? Again, why? How should we explain the language movement in 1948 if Bengalis wanted to live within Pakistan, and if we have opted for two-nation theory? If two-nation theory, then we are Muslim, you are also Muslim. We should live together. Then why should we come out with the issue of language? Why?
Okay.
And how to explain it?
Sorry to interrupt you again.
How to explain it?
Go on discussing this. And
so Bengali constituted a distinct, different, national entity or identity long before, over 1,000 years. That's why Field Marshal Ayub Khan, in his diaries, edited by Craig Baxter, said that, well, when we visit East Pakistan, as if we are visiting a foreign land, and the East Pakistanis, they worship Tagore as a prophet. This is the statement he made in his book. But we Bengalis, we have a different culture, what we call syncretistic culture, comprising, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam, 3. And we have a different brand of Islam, that is Sufism, which is moderate, which is tolerant, which is accommodative. That is
on that point, Professor Rashid. Thank you very much.
You must take this point into account if you want to explain the emergence of Bangladesh and disintegration of Pakistan. Right?
And could be hundreds
so
of
it
years.
is not because of military rule.
Move to Professor Yaqoob Khan Bangash. You have a couple of minutes to respond to any of the questions that you'd like.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Mahmood sir. Just a couple of points that I wanted to make. First, of course, as Uther actually asked the question about, what about the others? And I think that's very important that, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh do not just constitute, Hindus and Muslims. They have Sikhs, as Faisal mentioned, but they also have Christians and Anglo-Indians that Uther has actually done seminal work on. And I think this is also very important to remember that this was a very complicated mosaic. All of these communities also got split. So in the Punjab, for example, that I worked on Christians in the Punjab, it was 500,000 population that actually got split between East and West Pakistan, well, East and West Punjab, without having this is a conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So where do we come in? So I think that's a very important question. As Uther has actually shown through his work on Anglo-Indians, the whole question of Anglo-Indians, which again were a few 100,000 in India, the whole question was of betrayal by the British. The Brits have left, and they have left them in this bizarre kind of a situation. But what's really fascinating, which again, as Uther actually shows through his work, is how they then kind of build up their argument in India around the idea of reservations, around the idea of rights. and fundamental rights and this whole constitutional rights kind of an endeavor. So this was, I think this is also a very interesting thing to move beyond just the Hindu-Muslim binary that we are often stuck in when we are talking about partition, to actually look at, these kinds of understandings. And of course, I haven't even spoken about the Buddhist or the Jains. They of course had another perspective also. So I think it's important to populate this discussion on the partition beyond that. But let me also, so the second point that I really want to make is, and I wanted to reiterate, because I kind of said this a couple of times and Professor Harun has also mentioned this, so I wanted to talk about this, that partition happened because there was an elite agreement for it. And I think one must not forget that the partition happened because of the 1946 elections to a large extent, and the 46 elections, only had 11% of the population of India voting. So it was an elite election. It was an elite decision that people had actually made. And I think that is very important to understand. The point that I was earlier trying to make with Khwaja Nazmuddin, be him a Bengali or not, but he's part of the Nawab's family, the Nawab of Dhaka. The Nawab of Dhaka, it's interestingly, is not ethnically a Bengali, but that's another question. But even beyond him, Nurul Amin, even beyond him, Fazlur Rahman, all these kinds of Bengali, even ethnically Bengali elites of the Muslim League were actually very much for it, except for Hussain Shahid Sohrawardi. So my contention here is that the elite that was the pre-47 elite was very much of a particular kind, of a particular thought, and the elite that then develops, the political elite that then develops after 1947, including Mujibur Rahman when he comes up as a leader, or Maulana Bhashani and all these other people that actually come up, they are from a different mindset, they are from a different ideal, and they have popular support. They don't have elite people supporting them. And I think that is the big difference. And I think that is, when we're talking about Jinnah, and again, a lot of people forget, Jinnah did not speak an Indian language fluently. He knew Gujarati a bit, and he knew Urdu, Hindi kind of, to a certain extent, but he only spoke English really, really fluently. He could only read and write English, So when he's talking to Bengalis, and if he's talking to Khwaja Nazmuddin or Shahabuddin or Fazlur Rahman or Nurul Amin, these kinds of people give him one kahani and he accepts it, because for him it is not a public thing, because the public is not voting. The public hasn't voted in 1946. It's only a small percentage of the Indian population, of the subcontinental population, that's actually voted. When it actually comes up, and that's the big shocking thing, when in East Bengal they have the first election in 1954, the Muslim League loses pretty badly, and only manages to get 10 seats out of nearly 300. So that's what happens when it becomes a public question. And I think that's a distinction that we must understand, that a lot of what happens in 1947 is an elite compromise. It's an elite discussion. It happens for its particular reasons, but that's the framework we have. So to take it beyond to when people are involved, things change. And I think that is something, someone was actually quoting Nehru, for a long time. I am sure you have heard that very interesting incident that a family friend of the Nehrus in the late 1950s goes up to them and says, oh, my son wants to go to Britain. Where would you suggest, Oxford or Cambridge? And Nehru tells them and says, oh, I would suggest them to go to some place in India. And he said, well, why? And it's like, well, because it'll be hard to adjust. And they say, but you went to school there. And he said, yes, but who says I'm adjusted? Because again, Nehru was working in this framework, which was again a very elite kind of a framework. Nehru's first language was Urdu. He actually wrote Urdu much more beautifully than most members of the Muslim League. That was his first language. He could outspeak Urdu with the Jinnah any time of the day. So that was another kind of an environment. But then again, in 1951, when India had its first general election, you could see the undercurrent of Hindutva coming in. You could see the proto sort of Hindu ideals coming up, and that is something that Nehru really, really fights against. I'm sure all of you remember that Nehru had to threaten resignation for the widow divorce, for the Widow Remarriage Act, and all those kinds of things. So when the people are involved, as in India, as in Pakistan, there is a different reaction, because the people want something else, and the elites have been completely out of touch with the people, because if you don't need their vote to get elected, why would you care what they are really, really talking about? It's only in 1954 that the government in Pakistan gets a big shock, that, oh wow, East Pakistan is not with us. They've actually, you know, defeated the Muslim League pretty badly, because before that the people weren't involved. This is the first time people are involved. That's where the movement actually comes up. And what's really fascinating is that, you know, Mujibur Rahman's first 6 points are actually really anchored in the United Front manifesto of 1954. So it wasn't actually anything new. That is what Mujib had actually been saying for a long time. So I think the elite versus the people thing, I think one needs to really be very clear about when it comes to talking about the partition. But the last thing, you know, I really want to echo Faisal from where he actually left, and then said that, you know, it's very hard, again, 74 years down the line, to actually talk about a blame game. Things were moving really fast. You know, as I said earlier, it was the shameful flight, you know, the perils of adrenaline. It was really, really moving fast. So I think one needs to really kind of be careful in talking about a blame game or talking about a pattern, because a lot of the patterns become very obvious much later. A lot of the pitfalls become obvious very later, because, you know, as Jinnah, you know, going back to the whole argument that Jinnah created a country kind of divorced from history, he didn't really realize that Bengal would not like that. You know, he did not realize, you know, he wanted a language that will connect East and West Pakistan. So therefore he picked Urdu, which was not the language of either East Pakistan or West Pakistan. In 47, you know, not many people spoke Urdu in West Pakistan either, you know, let alone East Pakistan. So he wanted to create something new. Again, Urdu was the new bit, you know, Urdu was the new thing that he wanted to impose. That was an experiment, failed pretty miserably, you know, but that is something that kind of, you know, was behind the idea of it. You know, one of the things which I always wanted to mention about Urdu is that even though Jinnah said Urdu shall be the official language, the irony of the whole thing is, of course, and that began the language movement in East Pakistan. Till today, Urdu is not the official language of Pakistan. It is English. It was English at that time also, and it continued to be English. And there are very good reasons why that will remain. You know, there was a Supreme Court judgment a couple of years ago saying that, you know, that Urdu should become the official language, but it's never really become the official language. And the last thing that I really wanted to say to Dr. Harun-or-Rashid, you know, I just kind of used the phrase about 71, you know, just as a kind of a neutral phrase, but I should say that you always do remember, well, at least people like me remember in Pakistan, that Mujibur Rahman was the first elected Prime Minister of Pakistan. So we never kind of forget that. And the first person who got elected as Prime Minister through the votes of the people was Mujibur Rahman. And it's very sad that we never let him become the Prime Minister.
He was not elected Prime Minister. He was elected majority party leader.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. But he could have been the Prime Minister, yes.
I think it's my time to speak.
I just wanted to go to Professor Nurul Islam. I'm assuming you're not even more overwhelmed by the discussion.
I feel discriminated against throughout the whole discussion. I was not given enough time. Now, let's see. The question is, we are discussing partition, and we should have concentrated on discussion of very carefully on Lahore Resolution 1940. This is the root and the logic of partition is in the Lahore Resolution. What did it say? The Muslim majority provinces or states in East and West of India will be independent. Together or separate two states, that's a 1946 problem. Now, and the rest of India will be obviously majority Hindus. Now, how does it solve the problem? The problem was that if you have East and West Muslim majorities ruling, governing, and there will be minority Hindus in the same in India, Hindu majorities rule, and there will be minority Muslims. So there was an implicit idea of balancing one against the other, so that the economic and political rights of Hindus in Pakistan will be balanced by ensuring the economic and political rights of Muslims in India, where the Hindus will be in majority. You read, I request you, please read very carefully every sentence of Lahore Resolution and read the footnotes as well. In the footnotes of the Lahore Resolution, it says it is expected that the Muslim majority states will ensure economic and political rights for the Hindus, and Hindu majority states will ensure similarly economic and political rights for the Muslims. This is the footnote in the resolution. I request all of you, we are discussing partition, but you go all over the world. But I would concentrate on discussing very carefully its logic, its implications, and the result. And that's what my submission is, therefore, that we have been discussing partition to the extent all over the place. Now, as far as Bangladesh's creation is concerned, there is a serious problem in understanding the problem.
Exactly.
Pakistan was right from day one ruled by the army. It is not even mentioned by anybody. The 1/3 of the British Indian Army was inherited by Pakistan. And Pakistan, right from the day one, was dominated politically by army. And army needed one centralized government for command over resources to pay the huge expenditure of army. And this is never mentioned anywhere, but it's a very serious issue. And therefore, Pakistan was not ruled democratically, right from the day one. It's army ruled it. If you look at the stages, we are discussing all kinds of situations. So army rule, why was it necessary? A centralized army rule was necessary for access to resources to maintain this huge army. And that prevents having a sort of more decentralized system of government. Impossible. You cannot have type of government according to Rahul resolution by that kind of government where resources are decentralized. But it requires, army requires a centralized command of resources. This point is never realized, people. And that is the reason why, again, in 1971, what was the problem? What was the problem? That the 6th point, all the rest of it, meant that the resources will be generated in the provinces, and the central government will be having a contribution from the two parts to maintain the minimum functions of foreign affairs, defense. Correct? In that case, supposing the states say, no, we would not give you, make the necessary contribution, and the whole thing falls apart. This is never realized. But when you discuss all these things, these are the implications. It's inherent. The breakup was inherent in the system.
Exactly.
All the extraordinary resources, all kinds of issues are discussed. I don't understand all this. Keep to the logic and keep to the consequences of the situation. You cannot have, you see, Rahul resolution. That's why I would urge all of you, after this, to pay very serious attention. The logic of the situation was inevitable. This is how the situation has evolved. And now 71 is entirely different issue altogether. Why? Because 71 is a country, by that time, it was a country between 47 and 71, dominated by the army. Central government was dominated by army, and army means West Pakistan. This is never mentioned by anybody. So the inevitable consequences was who controls the army and who gives the resources to Pakistan at this army. The 6th point was basically could not be, remember, when 1966, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman announced, and all places in the world in Lahore, the 6th point. And what was the reaction of Yaqoob? That Mr. Mujib, I will meet your 6th point in 1 point, force of arms. Because 6th point means lack of resources for him. So therefore, it was inherent, already struggle started in 1966. The 6th point meant that access to resources would not be available for the central government to meet this huge expenditure. It will be decentralized to the units. I think unless you understand this logic, this discussion of partition all over the place, all over the area, I don't understand all this. I was amazed by the discussion and amused also partly. Now, you see the point, the partition of India was inherent in the situation, and breakup of Pakistan was also. I have a theory that says possibly Indian division could have been possibly prevented, but Pakistan breakup was inevitable.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Professor Islam, on that point, that perhaps
I do agree.
Was not inevitable, but that of Pakistan was. But I'll take your point. In fact, as I hand over to the organizers, and I think Sajidul Hassan Sajid will speak on behalf of them, the only point I'd like to make is the point that Professor Islam was alluding to when he referred to the Lahore Resolution, that we need to read history, not just the main text, but the footnotes as well. And I think we made a good beginning today. And we hope the Oxford, the three societies, the Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan societies at Oxford, would continue this discussion, because this is just a beginning, just an appetizer perhaps, but we need to continue. And obviously, as Professor Devji said, it's not a question of apportioning a blame. It's not a blame game. We need to understand the dynamics, the thoughts, and also the opportunities which may have been missed, because as we think about the future, the question of opportunities coming and opportunities being missed is, of course, a challenge that we'll have to be very cognizant of. So, Zahid, it's on to you.
Thank you, Akhtar Bhai. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And we thank the panelists and moderator for taking part in this historic event. We wish we could go on for much longer, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. But as Akhtar Bhai has said, this is just the beginning, and we hope the Oxford Bangladesh, the India and Pakistan societies, we hope and we will aim to host such intellectually stimulating, thought-provoking and challenging events more frequently in the future. And we hope to see you all then. Till then, stay healthy, stay safe. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the weekend. See you soon again. Thank you.